I didn't fall. I slid, slowly, humiliatingly, down the side of my kitchen counter, as if my body was trying not to alarm me while it failed. One moment I was rinsing a coffee mug, thinking about how quiet the house had become since retirement. The next, my vision narrowed, the room tilting just enough to make me grab for the sink. My legs didn't listen. They never do when it matters most. They folded without warning, and I found myself on the cool tile floor, my cheek pressed against a surface I had cleaned that morning without imagining it might be the last thing I felt clearly. There was pain. Not sharp, deep. The kind that doesn't ask for permission. I remember thinking, this is serious. And then, more quietly, this might be it. I reached for my phone. It was only a foot away, face down, stubbornly intact while I wasn't. My fingers trembled as I flipped it over. The screen lit up too bright. Too normal. I didn't call my children. That realization came later. In the moment, all I knew was that dialing felt complicated. Not because they wouldn't answer. I told myself they were busy. They always were. Work, travel, life. I had raised them to have full lives. I was proud of that. Pride is a strange thing to cling to when you're lying on a cold floor, unsure if you can stand again. I called emergency services instead. My voice sounded calm to my own ears, almost practiced, like I had rehearsed this scenario without knowing it. I think something's wrong, I said. I'm alone. The word alone hung in the air longer than the operator's pause. When the paramedics arrived, they were efficient. Kind, but brisk. One of them asked questions while the other checked my blood pressure, his brow tightening just slightly. They exchanged a look they thought I didn't see. Emergency contact, the woman asked, already holding her tablet. I opened my mouth. Closed it. Well, I said slowly, embarrassed by the pause, my children live in different cities. She waited. I mean, you can list them, but... That's okay, she said gently. We just need a name. A name. Just one. I gave her my eldest daughter's number. It felt logical. Old habits die hardest. She typed it in, nodded, and moved on. No one called her yet. Not then. The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and ceiling lights. I focused on breathing, on staying conscious, on not being dramatic. I had always prided myself on being low maintenance. Even now, I didn't want to be trouble. In the emergency room, time dissolved. Tests. Blood drawn. A curtain pulled around my bed that did nothing to block out the sounds of other people being attended to by someone who loved them enough to show up. A doctor stood at my side, his tone careful but urgent. We're admitting you, he said. There's internal bleeding. We need to operate. Operate. That word should have frightened me more than it did. Instead, my first thought was practical. Someone should know. A nurse asked if my family was on the way. They'd been contacted, I said, though I wasn't sure that was true yet. She smiled kindly, the way people do when they believe you're about to be okay because they need to believe that. As they wheeled me towards surgery, I stared at my phone resting on my chest. Still no messages. No missed calls. Just the time glowing back at me, indifferent. I wondered if they were asleep. If they'd see the call later and feel terrible. I imagined apologies. Hugs. Explanations. That's the thing about hope, it doesn't disappear just because logic tells it to. As the anesthesiologist leaned over me and asked me to count backward, I thought, absurdly, of how many times I had dropped everything when my children called. No matter where I was. No matter how small the emergency. The lights above blurred. The last thing I remember before darkness took me was thinking. Surely, by the time I wake up, someone will be there. I woke up to beeping. Not the sharp, panicked kind, just a steady rhythm, like something was keeping time while I tried to remember where I was. My mouth was dry. My throat burned faintly, as if I'd swallowed words I hadn't said yet. The ceiling above me was unfamiliar. White. Too white. Hospital white. I turned my head slightly, and pain answered before memory did. Surgery, my body reminded me. A nurse noticed my eyes open and smiled, relief flickering across her face in a way that felt practiced but still sincere. She leaned in, checked my vitals, asked me how I felt. Alive, I said, my voice hoarse. She nodded. That's a good start. I waited for the next question. Did your family arrive? But she didn't ask. She simply adjusted my fore and told me I'd done well, that the surgery had gone as planned, that the bleeding was controlled. You're stable, she said. We'll keep monitoring you. Stable. Such a strange word. It sounded like something you could rely on. When she left, the room settled into quiet again, machines humming, hallway footsteps passing by, voices drifting in from behind curtains that didn't quite close. I stared at my hands resting on the blanket. Pale. Slightly swollen. Hands that had held children once. Hands that had signed permission slips, written checks, steadied bicycles, wiped tears. I reached for my phone. Still nothing. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Time zones. Meetings. Flights. Emergencies that weren't mine. I had lived long enough to know life didn't pause just because yours did. Still, I watched the door. Across the hall, a woman laughed softly as someone adjusted her pillow. Down the corridor, I heard a man arguing with a doctor on behalf of someone else, his voice sharp with fear and love tangled together. I turned my face toward the wall. Hours passed. Or minutes. It was hard to tell in a place where light never really dimmed. Nurses came and went. A doctor stopped by briefly, explained what recovery would look like, asked if I had support at home. Yes, I said automatically. The word came out easily. Too easily. Later, a younger nurse with tired eyes checked my chart. She paused, glanced up at me, then back down. Will anyone be coming in today? She asked gently. There it was. Yes, I said again. Then, after a beat, added, they live far. She nodded, as if distance explained everything. Maybe it did. She squeezed my hand before moving on, and that small gesture stayed with me longer than it should have. By evening, the ache set in properly. Not just physical, though that was there, blooming and receding in waves, but something heavier. The kind of ache that sits behind your ribs and makes breathing feel like effort. I replayed memories instead of counting ceiling tiles. Birthday cakes I baked late at night. School plays I attended alone when schedules conflicted. Phone calls I answered no matter the hour. They'll come tomorrow, I told myself. The second day came. And went. No footsteps paused at my door. No familiar voices broke the monotony. My phone remained stubbornly silent except for notifications I didn't care about, news alerts, a reminder to pay a bill I'd already paid. On the third day, I stopped checking as often. Not because I didn't care, but because caring had started to feel like bruising something already tender. A woman in the bed beside mine, separated by only a thin curtain, had visitors constantly. They brought her flowers, magazines, food that smelled like home. I listened to their conversations without meaning to. Plans. Jokes. Complaints about parking. At one point, she asked them to step out so she could sleep. They kissed her forehead anyway. I felt something twist inside me then, not jealousy exactly. More like recognition. This was what was missing. This was the shape of the absence. That evening, as a nurse helped me sit up for the first time, pain sharp and breath shallow, she asked again if someone would be picking me up when I was discharged. I'll manage, I said. She hesitated. We like to be sure. I met her eyes. I am. It was the first time I meant it. Later, alone again, I stared at the door and realized something unsettling. not that no one had come, but that the world hadn't stopped because of it. Waiting rooms don't forget who waits alone. Neither do hospital beds. And somewhere between the beeping machines and the quiet footsteps in the hall, I began to understand that surviving and being remembered were not the same thing. Discharge day should have felt like a victory. That's what everyone kept calling it: good news, progress, back to normal. But when the nurse handed me the thin stack of instructions and asked who would be driving me home, the word victory felt misplaced. It assumed there had been a crowd waiting at the finish line. "There's a neighbor," I said after a moment. The words surprised me with how naturally they came out. "She said she'd help." The nurse smiled with relief. "That's good. We can't let you go alone." I nodded, even though part of me had expected to be allowed to try. While we waited, I sat fully dressed on the edge of the bed, feet dangling, hospital bracelets still hugging my wrist like a reminder I wasn't free yet. My phone rested in my lap. I hadn't checked it in hours. When I finally did, it offered nothing new. No missed calls. No apologies that arrived too late. The neighbor, Margaret, arrived right on time. She was in her late 70s, hair neatly brushed, cardigan folded over her arm. We'd exchanged polite greetings for years, the kind neighbors trade when collecting mail or commenting on the weather. I'd once watched her water my plants while I was away and felt grateful without knowing why. She looked smaller in the hospital hallway, but steadier than I felt. "There you are," she said, her voice warm. "You had me worried." I wanted to correct her. "We're not like that," I almost said. "You didn't need to worry." But she had. And she did. She signed the paperwork with practiced efficiency, listened carefully as the nurse explained my medications, asked questions I hadn't thought to ask. When she took my arm to steady me, her grip was firm without being intrusive. She didn't rush me. She didn't apologize for helping. In the car, she adjusted the seat so I could lean back comfortably. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was considerate. "I made soup," she said as we pulled out of the hospital lot. "Nothing fancy. Just something easy." "Thank you," I replied, and meant it more deeply than I was ready to examine. At home, everything felt slightly off. Familiar but rearranged. The couch where I'd slept through so many quiet evenings now looked too far away. The stairs felt taller. Margaret set my bag down, placed the soup in the fridge, and wrote the medication schedule on a notepad without asking if I wanted help. She just did. "I'll come by tomorrow morning," she said, slipping on her shoes. "Just to make sure you're up." I didn't argue. I didn't insist I'd be fine. I nodded and watched her leave, feeling something shift inside me that I couldn't name yet. That night, I slept in short bursts. Pain woke me. Fear followed. I reached for my phone once, out of habit, and then stopped. I placed it face down on the nightstand instead. The next morning, Margaret arrived with toast and a newspaper. She read the headlines aloud while I ate, her voice steady and unhurried. It felt grounding. Real. Later that day, a hospital administrator called to confirm my emergency contact information. "We have your daughter listed," she said. "Would you like to keep that?" I hesitated. "Could we change it?" I asked. "Just for now." "To whom?" I thought of Margaret, sitting at my kitchen table, carefully folding the newspaper. "My neighbor," I said. There was no judgment in the administrator's tone. Just efficiency. Of course. When I hung up, the significance of that choice settled slowly. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't anger. It was accuracy. Days passed. Recovery was slow. Margaret came every morning, then less frequently as I grew steadier. She never asked about my children. I never volunteered information. One afternoon, as she helped me water the plants, she glanced at me and said, "You're strong, you know." I smiled faintly. I didn't feel it. "Strength doesn't always announce itself," she replied. "Sometimes it just survives." That night, alone again but no longer abandoned, I sat with that thought. The woman who had held my hand when I stood up for the first time after surgery was not my daughter. And for the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge what that meant, without excuses, without bitterness. Just truth. The house sounded different once I started listening. Not in any dramatic way, no creaks or echoes I hadn't heard before, but the absence of interruption made every small sound feel deliberate. The hum of the refrigerator. The tick of the wall clock I'd considered replacing for years. The soft rasp of my own breathing as I moved from room to room, careful not to push too hard. Recovery is supposed to be restful. That's what people say. But there's a kind of exhaustion that comes from having too much time to think. Each morning followed the same quiet ritual. Medication. Toast. A slow walk down the hallway, counting steps without meaning to. Margaret came less often now, just enough to check in, just enough to remind me I wasn't invisible. I thanked her every time. She brushed it off, but I didn't. My children remained absent. At first, I framed it kindly. They don't know how serious it was. Then more practically. They're busy adults. Eventually, honesty crept in, unwelcome but persistent. They knew. They just didn't come. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It settled gradually, like dust you don't notice until the light hits it just right. One afternoon, I sat at the dining table sorting through mail, hospital bills, insurance statements, appointment reminders. Practical things. Necessary things. I lined them up neatly, just as I always had, and noticed how steady my hands were now. Healing had been slow, but it was happening. That's when I realized something else. No one had asked how I was managing any of this. Not the paperwork. Not the appointments. Not the fear that still visited at night, uninvited. I stopped checking my phone altogether after that. Not in anger. In relief. Without the constant anticipation of a message that never came, my days felt oddly calmer. I began to sleep more deeply. I started sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching the light fade, listening to the neighborhood settle into its routines. I noticed who waved as they passed. Who slowed down to ask if I was feeling better. Small kindnesses, but consistent ones. One morning, I attempted the stairs without holding the railing. Halfway up, my legs trembled, and I paused, heart racing, not from pain, but from the sudden understanding of how fragile things still were. I sat down on the step and laughed softly to myself. Not because it was funny, but because fear had a way of surprising you when you thought you'd already faced it. That was the moment I stopped pretending I didn't need help. I called my primary care office to schedule follow-ups. I organized my medication in a weekly box. I wrote down emergency numbers, real ones, this time, and taped them inside a cabinet. None of the names belonged to my children. That choice didn't feel cruel. It felt accurate. One evening, as I stood at the kitchen sink, the same place my body had betrayed me weeks earlier, I realized I wasn't afraid of being alone anymore. I was afraid of being mistaken about who would show up. That distinction mattered. When the phone finally rang, it startled me. I stared at it for a full second before answering, my heart thudding out of old habit. It was my eldest son. "Hey, Mom," he said, like we'd spoken yesterday. "Sorry it's been a while. Things have been hectic." I listened. I always did. He asked how I was doing, briefly, before launching into updates about work, traffic, travel plans. I waited for the moment he'd ask about the surgery, the hospital, the recovery. It never came. "I was thinking," he said near the end of the call, "maybe we should all get together soon. Talk about some things." "What things?" I asked. There was a pause. Not long. Just enough to register. "You know," he said. "The future. Planning. Stuff like that." After we hung up, I sat at the table and let the silence fill the room again. This time, it wasn't loud. It was clarifying. Recovery, I realized, wasn't just about my body knitting itself back together. It was about letting old expectations loosen their grip. In the quiet, without distraction, the truth had finally found its volume. And I was listening. The second call came 3 days after the first. This time it was my daughter. Her name lit up my phone while I was standing at the stove, stirring soup I'd learned to make thinner so I wouldn't tire myself out chewing. I watched it ring twice before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I needed to steady myself against a reaction I hadn't yet named. "Hi, Mom," she said brightly. Too brightly. I just wanted to check in. I told her I was recovering. That I was home. That everything was stable now. "That's good," she replied. "I'm glad you're okay." There was a pause after that. A small one. Uncomfortable. The kind that waits to be filled. "I heard from Mark," she continued, naming her brother. "He said you had a scare." A scare. I let the words sit between us. "Yes," I said. "I did." "Well," she said, exhaling, "you know how things get. I've been juggling so much lately. Work, the kids, travel, it's just been non-stop." I said nothing. "I would have come if I could," she added quickly. "You know that, right?" Did I? The conversation moved on the way these conversations always did, skimming surfaces, avoiding weight. She told me about her schedule, about renovations, about how expensive everything had become. At one point, she laughed and said, "Getting older is no joke, huh?" I smiled, though she couldn't see it. Before hanging up, she said, "We should probably all sit down together at some point. Just to talk. You've got a lot going on, and, well, we should be on the same page." The same page about what? I asked. Again, that pause. "You know," she said. "Things." After the call, I didn't feel angry. I felt exposed. It became clear then that these calls weren't about me. They were about reassurance. About easing something in them. A sense of obligation, perhaps. Or concern over things left unsaid. The visits followed soon after. They arrived together on a Sunday afternoon, carrying pastries from a bakery I used to like. The doorbell rang, and for a moment, I stood very still, hand on the knob, listening to their muffled voices through the door. I opened it with a polite smile. "Hug?" my daughter asked, already stepping forward. I accepted it, aware of how careful she was not to squeeze too tightly. How aware she suddenly seemed of my fragility. They sat in the living room, glancing around as if seeing the space with new eyes. Comments followed, about the couch, the shelves, the way the house still looked good. "You've kept everything so nice," my son said. I thanked him. They asked how I was feeling. I told them the truth, tired, but improving. They nodded, relieved. Then the conversation drifted. My son mentioned taxes. My daughter asked if I'd thought about downsizing. Someone brought up how hard it was to plan for the future without clarity. Clarity? I asked. "Well," my daughter said carefully, "we just want to make sure things are organized. You know, so nothing's confusing later." Later. I looked at them, my children, now grown, capable, composed, and felt something solidify inside me. Not resentment. Understanding. They had shown up now because now was safe. Now was orderly. Now required nothing from them except presence and polite concern. They hadn't come when my body was broken and unpredictable. When fear lived openly in the room. That difference mattered. When they left, promising to check in more often, I stood at the door long after it closed. I didn't cry. I made a cup of tea instead and sat at the table, thinking about paperwork. About records. About decisions I'd put off because they felt uncomfortable. For the first time, I didn't feel rushed by guilt. I felt steady. And somewhere beneath that steadiness, a quiet resolve began to take shape. They came back a week later. This time without pastries. Without pretense of a quick check-in. They arrived with intention, which I recognized immediately because it had the weight of expectation behind it. My daughter parked in the driveway like she used to when she still lived nearby, too close to the hedge, wheels turned slightly as if ready to leave quickly. My son followed in his car, stepping out with his phone still in his hand, finishing a message before looking up at the house. I watched from the window before opening the door. Not to brace myself. Just to observe. Inside, they settled into familiar roles. My daughter straightened a cushion that didn't need it. My son opened the blinds a little wider, letting in more light. Small gestures of ownership disguised as help. "You look better," my daughter said. "Stronger." "I feel stronger," I replied. It was true. They exchanged a glance, subtle but practiced. I'd seen it before, when they were children and thought they were being discreet. "We've been talking," my son said, sitting forward. "About the future." There it was again. The word that had been circling us for weeks. "I think it's important," my daughter added, "that we all feel secure about what comes next." Secure. Such an interesting choice. They spoke in careful tones, never outright demanding anything, but the direction was clear. They asked if I'd considered consolidating accounts. Whether I'd thought about making things simpler. If I'd updated documents recently. I answered honestly. Yes. Some things. Slowly. "You don't have to rush," my son said quickly. "We're just trying to be proactive." Proactive. I nodded, listening, not interrupting. There was a rhythm to their concern, a choreography I hadn't noticed before. Every sentence framed as support, every suggestion as care. At one point, my daughter said, "We just don't want strangers involved later." The word strangers landed sharply. I thought of Margaret, sitting at my kitchen table during those first difficult mornings. Of the nurse who held my hand. Of the bank teller who'd taken extra time to explain something without being asked. If those were strangers, what were my children? I didn't say any of this aloud. Instead, I excused myself to make tea. In the kitchen, my hands moved steadily, without hurry. I realized something then, how calm I felt. How unprovoked. When I returned, they were talking quietly to each other. They stopped when I set the cups down. "Mom," my son said, lowering his voice, "we just want to make sure things are handled properly. You've worked hard. It would be a shame if things got complicated." I met his eyes. Complicated for whom? I asked. Neither answered right away. The room felt smaller then, not because of tension, but because of clarity. I could see the shape of their concern clearly now. It wasn't malicious. It was practical. Self-protective. Human. But it wasn't love. When they left, my daughter hugged me longer than necessary. "We're here now," she whispered. I nodded. After the door closed, I didn't sit down right away. I walked through the house instead, touching surfaces, opening drawers, grounding myself in what was mine. That night, I pulled out a folder I hadn't opened in years. Medical records. Account statements. Insurance policies. The practical skeleton of a life. I didn't feel afraid looking at it. I felt prepared. Their smiles had been polite. Concerned. Almost convincing. But they hadn't come back because I survived. They came back because now I could be planned for. I spread the documents across the dining table the next morning like I was preparing for a quiet audit of my own life. Not in anger. Not with shaking hands. Just carefully. There were hospital discharge papers, insurance summaries, prescription lists. A folder labeled emergency that I'd assembled years ago and never revisited. Inside it, my children's names were written in ink that now looked faint, as if time itself had been erasing them. I added a new page. Dates. The day I collapsed. The day of surgery. The days I woke up and waited. Next to each date, I wrote what happened. No calls. No visits. No messages. It felt strange to write absence down, but once I did, something shifted. Absence stopped being emotional. It became factual. I opened my phone and scrolled through my call log. It took less than a minute to confirm what I already knew. The first call from my children came weeks after the surgery. Not hours. Not days. Weeks. I wrote that down too. I wasn't building a case against them. I was building one for myself. Later that afternoon, I went to the bank. Not to move money, just to ask questions. The manager, a woman I'd known casually for years, recognized me immediately. "I heard you'd been unwell," she said kindly. "I'm glad to see you back." She asked if I needed help walking. I declined, grateful but steady. We sat in her office while she reviewed my accounts. She explained which ones had beneficiaries listed, which ones didn't, which ones would default to probate if nothing changed. "Some of these were set up a long time ago," she said gently. "Things evolve." "They do," I agreed. She asked if anyone else was involved in my financial planning. "My children assume they are," I said carefully. "But I haven't made any recent changes." She nodded, professional, neutral. Assumptions can cause confusion later. That word again. Confusion. I realized then how much of my life I had organized around preventing confusion for others. Around smoothing things over before they became uncomfortable. At home, I made a list of what I owned. The house. The savings. Personal items. Things with meaning no one else could see. I listed debts too. Medical bills. Ongoing costs. The reality of what survival actually required. No one else had asked about any of this. That evening, I called a lawyer. It wasn't dramatic. I left a message, my voice calm, asking for a consultation. When he called back the next day, his tone was straightforward, unhurried. "You're allowed to change your mind," he told me. "At any point. For any reason." "I don't want to punish anyone," I said. He paused. "Then don't." But clarity isn't punishment. That sentence stayed with me. Before bed, I placed all the papers back into their folders. Neat. Complete. Grounding. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. Not because everything was decided. Because nothing was vague anymore. Paper doesn't lie. It doesn't soften or exaggerate. It just records what is, and what isn't. And what it recorded, clearly and quietly, was this. When my life was on the line, I survived without them. That fact didn't make me bitter. It made me honest. She came alone this time. My daughter stood on the porch with her keys in one hand and her phone in the other, as if she hadn't decided which one mattered more yet. She smiled when I opened the door, small, careful, rehearsed. "I just wanted to talk," she said. "Just us." I stepped aside and let her in. She didn't sit right away. She wandered the living room instead, picking up a framed photo from the shelf. One of her as a child, missing 2 teeth, standing in the backyard with a balloon twisted around her wrist. "I forgot you still had this," she said. "I didn't," I replied. She placed the frame back down gently, then sat across from me, folding her hands in her lap. "I feel terrible about everything," she began. "I really do." I waited. She took a breath, then another, as if summoning the right version of herself. "I should have come sooner. I know that. I didn't realize how serious it was. By the time I understood, everything was already over." "Over?" I asked. She flushed slightly. "I mean, the surgery. The worst part." I nodded. "Yes. That part." Her apology moved quickly after that, like it had somewhere else to be. She talked about stress. About responsibilities. About how hard it was to drop everything when life kept pulling her in different directions. I hope you can understand, she said. I never meant to hurt you. I looked at her then, really looked. At the way she leaned forward, eyes searching my face not for forgiveness, but for reassurance. For relief. I understand, I said quietly. Her shoulders loosened, just a little. I knew you would, she said, smiling. You always do. That was the moment it fell apart. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just, gently. What would you have done, I asked, if I hadn't? She blinked. What do you mean? If I hadn't survived, I clarified. If there hadn't been up later. The room went very still. She looked down at her hands. That's not fair. I'm not trying to be fair, I said. I'm trying to be accurate. She shifted in her seat. Mom, this isn't about that. Isn't it? I asked. She sighed, the sound threaded with frustration now. I came here to apologize. I don't know what else you want from me. There it was. The apology had reached its limit. I don't want anything, I said. And meant it. She hesitated, then said, Mark and I have been talking. We just think it would help if things were settled. So no one's scrambling later. Later again. I felt no anger. Only distance. You're worried about scrambling, I said. I was worried about surviving. She opened her mouth, then closed it. The silence stretched, not heavy, but revealing. I said I was sorry, she repeated, softer now. Yes, I said. You did. But apologies are living things. They breathe, or they don't. Hers had arrived with conditions. With timing. With expectations of absolution. It wasn't empty, but it wasn't enough. When she left, she hugged me briefly, awkwardly. We'll figure this out, she said. I nodded. After the door closed, I sat alone in the quiet and realized something surprising. I didn't feel wounded. I felt finished. Not with her. With the version of motherhood that required endless understanding at the cost of truth. That night, I slept deeply. No questions chasing me into dreams. No rehearsed conversations waiting for morning. The apology hadn't healed anything. But it had clarified everything. The lawyer's office was smaller than I expected. Not the imposing, polished space I'd imagined when I first made the appointment, but a modest room with a desk that showed signs of use and chairs that were comfortable without trying to impress anyone. It suited the mood I was in, direct, unembellished. He shook my hand, offered water, and waited. That waiting mattered. He didn't rush me into explanations or assumptions. He let me begin where I needed to. I'm not angry, I said. I just want things to be correct. He nodded. That's usually the healthiest place to start. I told him everything. The collapse. The surgery. The silence. The return. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't soften it either. I laid it out the way I had on paper, dates, facts, choices. When I finished, he leaned back slightly and said something that surprised me. You know you don't owe anyone an explanation for how you arrange your affairs. I know, I said. But knowing and believing aren't always the same. That's true, he said gently. But the law can help with the believing part. He explained my options slowly. How wills could be changed. How beneficiaries worked. What rights adult children had, and didn't have. He spoke without judgment, without pushing me in any direction. You're not disowning anyone, he said at one point. You're just deciding. Deciding. That word felt solid. Grounded. Different from withholding or denying. This wasn't about punishment. It was about alignment. What if they're hurt? I asked. They might be, he said honestly. But hurt isn't the same as harm. And guilt isn't a legal requirement. I let that sink in. He showed me how to make things clear, how to prevent disputes, confusion, assumptions. He emphasized documentation, transparency, and timing. Doing this now, he said, while you're well and of sound mind, protects you as much as it protects everyone else. I thought of the hospital bed. Of the way my children had waited until certainty returned before appearing. I'd like to move forward, I said. He nodded and slid a folder across the desk. At home later, I sat at the dining table again, pen in hand. This time, I wasn't recording absence. I was recording intention. I didn't rush. I thought carefully about what mattered. About the people who had shown up without expectation. About causes I believed in. About what kind of legacy felt honest, not impressive, just true. There was no anger guiding my choices. No urge to shock or retaliate. Just calm. That night, I didn't tell anyone what I'd done. I didn't need to. For the first time since the surgery, I felt something close to relief, not because the future was resolved, but because it was no longer being assumed by others. The law, I learned, doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't shame or plead. It simply stands there, quietly reminding you that your life, and everything built from it, belongs to you. And for the first time in a long while, guilt had nothing left to say. They assumed there was still time. That was the mistake they made, the quiet one. The kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already irreversible. We were sitting at the same dining table where I'd once helped them with homework, corrected spelling mistakes, signed permission slips without reading the fine print because I trusted the world with them then. Now they sat across from me with notebooks and phones, posture attentive, voices measured. "This isn't meant to pressure you," my son said carefully. "We just think it would be easier if we knew where things stood." I nodded. I poured tea. I didn't rush. My daughter added, "We're not asking you to do anything today. We just want to understand your wishes." Wishes. Such a gentle word for something that carried so much weight. They spoke as if decisions lived in the future, as if I were still waiting to begin. As if my survival had simply paused life, not changed it. I let them talk. About organization. About avoiding confusion. About how difficult things could become if nothing was written down. "You know how these things go," my son said. "We've seen it with friends. Families fall apart over misunderstandings." I looked at him and thought, families fall apart long before paperwork ever enters the room. When there was a natural break in the conversation, I set my cup down. "I should tell you something," I said. They both looked up. "I already took care of it." The words landed softly. No emphasis. No drama. "Took care of what?" my daughter asked. "My will," I said. "My directives. Everything." There it was. The shift. Not explosive, just visible. Their expressions tightened, the way people do when they realize they've misjudged the timing of something important. "You mean, you started the process?" my son asked. "No," I said gently. "I finished it." Silence stretched across the table. "When?" my daughter asked. I thought back to that morning at the lawyer's office. To the way my hand hadn't shaken. To the calm that had surprised even me. "During recovery," I said. "Months ago." They exchanged a look, quick, sharp. "We didn't know," my son said. "I didn't announce it," I replied. "I didn't need to." My daughter leaned forward. "Mom, what exactly did you decide?" That question, exactly, told me everything. "I decided based on who was present," I said. "Who helped? Who showed up when things were uncertain?" "That's not fair," she said immediately. I didn't argue. "I'm not saying this to punish anyone," I continued. "I'm saying it because I don't want assumptions hanging over us anymore." My son cleared his throat. "So, what does that mean for us?" There it was. Not how did you feel? Not why didn't we know? Just, what does that mean for us? It means, I said calmly, that everything is settled. They waited. I've made provisions for myself first, I added. For my care. My independence. And then for the people and causes that were part of my life when it mattered. My daughter's voice dropped. And your children? I held her gaze. You are not excluded from my life, I said. But inheritance is not the same thing as relationship. The word surprised even me, not because they were harsh, but because they were clear. My son pushed his chair back slightly, then stopped himself. We thought. I mean, we assumed. I know, I said. That's why I wanted to say this out loud. They didn't argue after that. Not really. There were questions. Careful ones. There was disbelief, disguised as concern. But beneath it all was something unmistakable. Finality. They had come expecting to influence a decision. Instead, they were being informed of one already made. Later, after they left, I sat alone at the table and felt something settle in my chest, not triumph. Not relief exactly. Peace. I hadn't taken anything away. I had simply stopped waiting to be considered. They didn't raise their voices. I noticed that first. How carefully they kept themselves composed, as if volume might fracture something already fragile. They asked questions instead, measured, restrained, circling the edges of what they had just learned. So it's done, my son asked. There's no room to adjust things? I shook my head gently. No. My daughter folded her arms, then unfolded them again. She smiled faintly, the way people do when they're trying to keep a situation from slipping away. I just think, she said, that decisions made during recovery can be influenced by stress. By fear. I considered that. I was afraid, I agreed. But I wasn't confused. She glanced at her brother. He avoided her eyes. This feels sudden, he said. It isn't, I replied. It only feels that way to you. That landed. They tried another approach then, not pleading, not anger. Reason. Logic. Familiarity. We're family, my daughter said. That should count for something. It does, I said. Just not in the way you're thinking. My son leaned forward. We weren't trying to hurt you. I know, I said. And I did. That was the strangest part, not that they didn't care, but that their caring had limits. Boundaries drawn around inconvenience. Around uncertainty. Around me. We assumed you'd understand, my daughter said quietly. I always did, I said. That's why this is different. Silence settled again. Heavier this time, but still contained. They looked around the room, as if searching for some version of me they recognized, someone softer, someone apologetic. Someone who would reconsider. Instead, they found me steady. I want to be clear, I said. This isn't about withholding love. It's about acknowledging reality. My daughter's voice tightened. So that's it? That's it, I said. There was a shift then, not in words, but in posture. In the way they leaned back. In the way they stopped trying to persuade and started absorbing. Entitlement doesn't always arrive loud. Sometimes it arrives as shock, the disbelief that something expected will not be delivered. My son stood first. We need time to process this. I understand, I said. At the door, my daughter paused. She turned back, her face softer now, stripped of strategy. You didn't even ask us why we weren't there, she said. I didn't need to, I replied. Your absence already answered that. She swallowed, then nodded once. Okay. After they left, the house felt unusually calm. Not empty, calm. I sat in the same chair and let myself feel everything I hadn't during the conversation. There was sadness. Of course there was. Letting go of expectations always carries a quiet grief. But there was also something else. Relief. I hadn't argued. I hadn't defended myself. I hadn't justified my pain or my decisions. I had simply stated what was true and allowed it to stand. That night, I walked through the house and noticed how light my steps felt. How the air didn't feel charged anymore. Entitlement collapses not when it's confronted, but when it's no longer accommodated. And for the first time since my body gave out on that kitchen floor, I felt fully upright again. I didn't hear from them for weeks after that. Not a call. Not a message. The silence returned, but this time, it felt different. It wasn't absence born of neglect. It was distance born of recalibration. I let it be. In the past, I would have filled that space. Sent a message. Offered reassurance. Explained myself again in softer language. This time, I didn't. I was learning something new at 61. Silence doesn't always need repair. My days settled into a rhythm that felt intentional. Morning walks, short but steady. Doctor appointments that no longer scared me. Meals prepared with care instead of urgency. I started writing things down again, not evidence this time, but reflections. What I needed. What I no longer wanted to carry. One afternoon, while waiting at the clinic, a woman around my age struck up a conversation. We spoke about recovery, about how bodies surprise you after a certain point. Before leaving, she said, "You don't owe anyone your pain." The sentence stayed with me. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table and thought about how many times I had tried to make my suffering palatable for others. How often I'd minimized it so no one would feel uncomfortable. So no one would feel guilty. But guilt is not a bridge. It doesn't connect people, it pressures them. When my daughter finally called, her voice was cautious. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what you said." I listened. "I don't agree with everything," she continued, "but I see now that you went through something real. Something we weren't there for." "I know," I said. There was a pause. "I don't know where that leaves us." "That's okay," I replied. "We don't have to decide that today." She sounded surprised by that. "You're not angry?" "No," I said. "I'm clear." After the call, I realized something important. I wasn't trying to punish them by withholding inheritance. I wasn't trying to teach a lesson. I was honoring the truth of my own survival. Survival is not just staying alive. It's deciding what gets access to you afterward. I stopped explaining my choices to anyone who asked. Friends. Distant relatives. Curious acquaintances. "This is what feels right for me," became enough. The house began to feel less like a waiting room and more like a home again. I rearranged furniture. Gave away things I'd been saving for no reason. I planted something new in the backyard, not because it would last forever, but because it would grow now. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the houses, I felt an unfamiliar but welcome sensation. Peace without apology. I didn't owe my children my survival. I didn't owe them proof, or sacrifice, or inheritance as compensation for being their mother. I had already given them a life. What I owed myself was honesty. Protection. A future that reflected who stood with me when everything was uncertain. And in claiming that, quietly and without drama, I realized I had already won something far more valuable than approval. I had won myself back. Legacy used to feel like something that came after. After death. After decisions. After conversations you didn't want to have while you were still alive. I used to think legacy was about what remained when you were gone, what people inherited, what they remembered. Now I understood it differently. Legacy is what you choose to live with. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. There were no announcements, no confrontations, no emotional speeches. Life simply continued. And in that continuation, I noticed how much lighter it felt. I began saying no more often. Not sharply. Just honestly. When my daughter suggested a family gathering to clear the air, I told her I wasn't ready. When my son asked if I'd reconsider certain decisions down the line, I told him there was nothing to reconsider. The world didn't end. Instead, something else happened. People adjusted. Margaret still came by on Thursdays. We sat at the kitchen table with tea and talked about ordinary things, books, weather, the neighbor's dog that barked too much. She never asked about my children. She didn't need to. She knew what showing up looked like. I started volunteering 2 mornings a week at a local community pantry. Nothing grand. Just organizing shelves, greeting people, listening. It grounded me. Reminded me that usefulness doesn't expire with age. One afternoon, a woman thanked me for being patient with her. "You make people feel safe," she said. I almost laughed. Safety was something I had once believed came from family by default. At home, I went through closets and drawers, donating things I'd kept out of habit. I stopped saving objects for people who might not want them. Instead, I kept what I used. What I loved. I rewrote letters I drafted years ago, ones filled with explanations and apologies I no longer felt compelled to offer. I threw them away without rereading them. This was my legacy now, clarity without cruelty. Occasionally, grief surfaced, not for what I'd lost, but for what I'd once hoped for. For the version of motherhood that promised permanence and reciprocity. I let that grief exist without rushing it away. Healing, I learned, doesn't mean pretending something didn't matter. It means accepting that it did, and choosing not to let it define you. One evening, my son stopped by unannounced. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, hands in his pockets. "I just wanted to see you," he said. I let him in. We talked about neutral things. Work. Weather. He didn't mention money. I didn't mention the past. When he left, he hugged me, tentative, unsure. It wasn't resolution. But it was real. And real was enough. As I watched him drive away, I didn't feel regret. I felt grounded. Present. Whole. Legacy isn't about control. It isn't about punishment or reward. It's about alignment, between your values and your choices. At 61, I wasn't closing a chapter. I was finally writing one with my own name at the center. The morning light comes differently now. It doesn't rush in like it used to, demanding attention. It settles instead, slow, deliberate, touching the edges of the room before finding me. I wake without urgency. Without that old reflex to check my phone for messages that might explain silence. I make my coffee and stand by the window, watching the neighborhood come alive in small, ordinary ways. A man walks his dog. Someone loads groceries into a car. Life, unremarkable and persistent, continues. So do I. There was a time when survival felt like something I had to justify. As if making it through something difficult required permission, or at least validation, from the people I loved most. I don't think I realized how deeply I believed that until it was tested. Lying in that hospital bed, waiting for footsteps that never came, I thought absence was the worst thing that could happen. I was wrong. The worst thing would have been surviving, and returning to the same quiet erasure. Instead, I chose differently. Not dramatically. Not loudly. I didn't announce boundaries or make speeches. I simply stopped negotiating my worth. I stopped confusing love with access, obligation with entitlement. Some days are still heavy. I won't pretend otherwise. There are moments, holidays, birthdays, ordinary afternoons, when memory tugs at me. When I think of who I was when I believed motherhood meant permanent self-sacrifice. I don't shame that woman. She did the best she could with the understanding she had at the time. But I don't live as her anymore. Now, my life is smaller in some ways, and fuller in others. My circle is quieter, but it is honest. The people in it know how to show up. They know how to stay. I tend to my health carefully. I attend appointments without fear. I keep my documents organized, not as armor, but as affirmation that I am allowed to plan for myself. Sometimes, my children call. Sometimes they don't. When they do, I listen without leaning forward. Without shrinking. Without preparing to fix what was never mine alone to carry. There is room now, for connection, if it grows naturally. And for peace, if it doesn't. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch, Margaret joined me with 2 cups of tea. We watched the sky change color as the sun lowered. "You look settled," she said. "I am," I replied. And I was. Not because everything turned out the way it was supposed to. But because I finally understood that life doesn't owe us symmetry. It owes us honesty. I survived something that could have taken me quietly. And in surviving, I learned something just as important. I am not required to disappear to be loved. I am not required to be convenient to be worthy. I am not required to leave everything behind for people who didn't stay when it mattered. My victory wasn't revenge. It was presence. It was choosing to remain, fully, deliberately, unapologetically, in my own life. I am still here. And for the first time in a very long while, that feels like enough.